There is a specific weight to the silence in a room like this, a heaviness that settles into the marrow of your bones before a single word is spoken. It smells of lemon floor wax, old paper, and the invisible, suffocating pressure of expectations that were never designed for people who look like me. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always do, not out of eagerness, but out of a necessity to claim the space, to anchor myself in the geography of a room that often feels like a turbulent sea designed to capsize my existence. This university, with its ivy-covered brick and Gothic arches, likes to pride itself on tradition, on the preservation of high culture. But what they often mean by tradition is exclusion. I sat there, the oak of the desk cool under my forearms, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of light cutting through the window. Those dust motes were the only things in this room moving without a permit, without the fear of being analyzed, categorized, or dismissed. I thought about the paper sitting in the stack on Professor Halloway's desk at the front of the room. It was an essay I had bled over, a piece of writing that felt less like an assignment and more like an exorcism. I had taken a risk. In a syllabus dominated by the dead white giants of literature, Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, I had chosen to write about the intricate, rhythmic complexity of African-American vernacular English, not as a dialect to be corrected, but as a linguistic fortress, a poetic structure with its own rigid grammar and unparalleled beauty. I knew what I was walking into. I knew Halloway's reputation. She was the gatekeeper of the canon, a woman who treated the English language like a museum exhibit behind glass, something to be observed, not touched, and certainly not remixed. As the other students began to trickle in, filling the empty seats with the rustle of expensive jackets and the murmur of privileged indifference, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. It wasn't fear. I had moved past fear by my sophomore year. It was the tension of a soldier waiting in the trench, knowing the shelling is about to begin. I watched them, my peers, these bright young minds who could navigate this space with a casual ease that I had to curate and manufacture every single morning. They threw their bags down. They laughed about weekend parties. They didn't look at the stack of graded essays on the front desk with a sense of existential dread. For them, a bad grade was a nuisance, a blemish on a transcript that their fathers could make disappear with a phone call. For me, in this seminar, on this day, that paper was proof of life. It was a declaration that my voice, the voice of my father, the voice of the barber shop and the church pew, belonged in this hallowed hall just as much as their sterile prose. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale academic air, and centered myself. I checked my watch. 2 minutes until she walked in. 2 minutes until the performance began. I adjusted my cuffs, smoothed the cover of my notebook, and prepared my face. The mask of the good student, the mask of the quiet observer. It is a survival mechanism, this calmness. If I get angry, I am a stereotype. If I get loud, I am a threat. So I sit, I wait. I let the silence build around me like armor, knowing that when the storm breaks, I must be the rock that the water crashes against, unmoving, unyielding, and undeniably present.
The genesis of that essay wasn't in the classroom, it was in the kitchen of my childhood home, listening to the cadence of my grandfather's stories. He never finished high school, but he could weave a narrative that held more emotional truth and structural complexity than anything I had read in this seminar. When Professor Halloway assigned the topic, Style and Substance in Modern Rhetoric, I saw an opening, a crack in the wall. She wanted us to analyze the effectiveness of language, the way syntax conveys authority. I decided to challenge the very premise of what she considered authoritative. I spent 3 nights without sleep, fueled by cheap coffee and the burning desire to prove a point that hadn't even been asked. I wrote about the code switching that Black men perform daily, the linguistic gymnastics required to survive in spaces like this, and I wrote it using the very vernacular she despised, blending it seamlessly with high academic theory. It was a dangerous hybrid. I was quoting Foucault and Derrida, but I was weaving them into the rhythm of a spoken word piece. I wanted to show that intellectual rigor does not require the erasure of cultural identity. I remember sitting at my desk at 3 a.m., the blue light of the laptop stinging my eyes, asking myself if I was making a mistake. Was this self-sabotage? Was I throwing away my GPA on a point of pride? I looked at the photo of my grandfather on the wall. He stood tall in his mechanic's uniform, a man who spoke with his hands and his heart. If I wrote this paper the way Holloway wanted, dry, detached, colorless, I would be betraying him. I would be agreeing with her silent premise that his way of speaking was broken, that our way of communicating was lesser. I couldn't do it. So I doubled down. I sharpened the edges of my argument. I made the prose sing with the rhythm of the block, the cadence of the pulpit. I knew it was excellent. I knew, objectively, that the writing was tighter, stronger, and more evocative than anything my peers were submitting. But I also knew where I was. I was in a room where excellence is often confused with conformity. Now, sitting in the lecture hall, waiting for the verdict, I replayed those late-night decisions. I traced the grain of the wood on the desk, grounding myself in the physical reality of the moment. The doubt tried to creep in. That insidious voice that whispers, "You should have just played it safe. You need this degree. You need this recommendation letter." But the other voice, the one that sounded like my grandfather, was louder. It told me that safety is a myth for people like us. We are never truly safe in these institutions, so we might as well be true. I watched the goer. The handle turned. The chatter in the room died down instantly. The air shifted from anticipation to anxiety. Professor Holloway entered. She was a small woman, sharp-featured, with eyes that scanned the room like a hawk looking for a field mouse. She carried the stack of papers against her chest like a shield. I saw the red ink on the margins even from the third row. My heart hammered against my ribs, a slow, heavy thud. I kept my face impassive. I was ready, or at least I prayed I was.
Professor Holloway had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a smudge on a pristine window. She didn't teach, she corrected. She viewed her role not as a gardener nurturing growth, but as a sculptor, chipping away at what she perceived to be excess, until only the hard, white marble of European tradition remained. She placed the stack of essays on the podium with a deliberate, heavy hand, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. "I have graded your submissions," she announced, her voice crisp, devoid of warmth. "And I must say, for a graduate-level seminar, I am profoundly disappointed." The class shifted uncomfortably. Papers rustled, eyes averted. This was her favorite theater, the public shaming. She believed that humiliation was a pedagogical tool, a fire that burned away mediocrity. I watched her hands. They were pale, skeletal hands, fluttering over the papers like moths. She wasn't looking for the best paper to praise. She was looking for the victim. I saw her pull a stapled document from the middle of the pile. My stomach dropped. I recognized the font. I recognized the formatting. It was mine. But she didn't call my name. Not yet. She held it up, pinching the corner as if it were contaminated. "There is one essay in particular," she said, a small, cruel smile touching her lips, "that exemplifies the complete collapse of academic standards in the modern era." She looked around the room, making eye contact with everyone but me. It was a game she played. She assumed the author would be hiding, shrinking. I forced myself to hold her gaze when it finally swept over me, but she looked right through me, not expecting the author of such collapse to be the student who had aced her midterm. She saw me as a body in a seat, not a mind to be reckoned with. "This paper," she continued, waving it slightly, "attempts to discuss the nuances of rhetoric, yet it fails to master the basic tenets of the English language. It is filled with slang. It is conversational. It is," she paused, searching for the most damaging word, "pedestrian." The word hung in the air. Pedestrian. Common. Low. I felt the heat rise up the back of my neck, but I kept my hands folded. She hadn't named me. She was dissecting the work anonymously, a tactic designed to strip the writer of defense while inviting the rest of the class to join in the mockery. I saw the student next to me, a wealthy legacy admission named Chad, smirk and lean back. He felt safe. He knew his essay on Hemingway was dry, derivative, and perfectly safe. Holloway flipped to the first page. "Let me share a few excerpts," she said, "so that we may all learn what not to do."
This was the wall I had hit so many times before, the wall that says there is only one way to speak, one way to think, one way to be intelligent. She was about to read my words, words I had crafted with love and precision, and she was going to twist them into a joke. I tightened my core. I focused on my breathing. In, out, in, out. Do not react. Do not give her the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. Not yet.
She began to read, and her voice was a weapon. She took sentences that I had written with the rhythmic cadence of a jazz improvisation and flattened them, reading them with a stilted, nasal monotone that stripped them of their power. The author writes, she intoned, looking over her spectacles, that the language of the street is not a broken version of the academy, but a parallel processor of truth. She paused, letting a silence stretch out that was meant to be filled with derision. A parallel processor of truth, she repeated, chuckling dryly. One wonders if the author is writing a sociology paper or a rap album. A few students tittered nervously. The sound grated on my nerves like sandpaper. She continued, moving to a section where I had deliberately used AAVE grammar rules to deconstruct a passage from Faulkner. Here, she said, pointing a manicured finger at the page, we see a complete disregard for subject-verb agreement. He be steady watching, the author writes. He be. She pronounced the words as if they were foreign, alien, toxic. This is not English. This is laziness. This is a student who is not bothered to open a grammar textbook, let alone internalize the rigorous standards of this institution. Every word she spoke was a distortion. She was mocking the very thing she claimed to teach, the analysis of language. She couldn't hear the tense, the habitual be that conveys a continuity of action that standard English requires complex phrasing to replicate. She saw error where there was precision. She saw ignorance where there was history. I sat there, and for a moment I felt a flash of pure, hot rage. It wasn't just for me. It was for every black student who had ever been told that the way they spoke to their mothers, their brothers, their community was wrong. It was for the brilliance that gets filtered out of these rooms because it doesn't wear a tie. But I pushed the rage down. Rage is fuel, but uncontrolled, it is an explosion that destroys the engine. I needed to be cold. I needed to be surgical. I watched her face, the way her lips curled in distaste. She was enjoying this. She felt superior. She felt like the guardian of the gate, keeping the barbarians at bay. She didn't realize the barbarian was already inside, sitting 3 rows back, taking notes on her arrogance. She read another sentence, one where I had described the sonic weight of silence in the inner city. Melodramatic, she declared. Unsubstantiated. Emotional. She treated emotion like a contaminant in the laboratory of literature. I looked at Chad next to me. He was drawing a doodle in his notebook, completely disengaged, confident that his mediocrity protected him. I realized then that Holloway didn't hate the essay because it was bad. She hated it because it was alive. It had a pulse, and nothing terrified her more than something she couldn't kill, dissect, and label. She was almost done with her critique. I could feel the crescendo coming. She was building up to the final dismissal, the moment she would toss the paper aside as trash. But she had one more card to play. She wanted to know who had dared to bring this street into her sanctuary. The air in the room grew thin. She had made her point, or so she thought. She had eviscerated the style, the syntax, and the soul of the essay. Now she wanted a body. She wanted to attach this failure to a face, to make an example that would serve as a warning to the rest of the cohort. "I rarely do this," she announced, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that echoed loudly in the silent hall. "But I think it is important for the author to understand the gravity of this submission. We are not in high school. We are not in a creative writing workshop for amateurs. This is an Ivy League seminar." She paused for effect. "If you want to write like this, there are community colleges that might accept it, but not here." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was precise, calculated, and designed to crush. She flipped the essay over to the cover page, which she had deliberately ignored until now. I watched her eyes. I saw the moment the neurological signal traveled from her retina to her brain. I saw the furrow of her brow.
She blinked. She expected, I knew, to see the name of one of the athletes, or perhaps one of the transfer students she deemed underprepared. She did not expect to see the name of the student who had the highest average in the department. She did not expect to see the name of the young man she had praised just last week for his quiet diligence. She stared at the page for a second too long. The silence stretched. The class held its breath. They wanted the blood sport. They wanted to see who would be the sacrificial lamb. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I let her sit in her confusion. She looked up, her eyes scanning the back of the room, then the middle. She was looking for a caricature. She was looking for the stereotype she had constructed in her mind while reading the paper. She passed over me at first, her gaze sliding off me because I didn't fit the profile of the illiterate writer she had just described. I was wearing a pressed Oxford shirt. I was sitting with perfect posture. I was the model student. Her cognitive dissonance was vibrating in the air. She looked down at the paper again, as if checking to see if the letters had rearranged themselves. Then, slowly, inevitably, her eyes came back to me. They locked onto mine. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a moment where she tried to reconcile the work she despised with the student she respected. It was a beautiful, terrible moment. The realization was dawning on her that the street she had mocked was sitting right in front of her, wrapped in the camouflage of her own expectations. She cleared her throat, but the sharpness was gone, replaced by a confused falter. She had to say it. She had committed to the reveal. There was no going back.
Marcus? Thorne? The name hung in the air, a question mark where a period should have been. She didn't say it with the thunderous condemnation she had planned. She said it with bewilderment. The heads of 20 students snapped toward me like they were on a single pivot. The collective gasp was audible. Marcus Thorne. The guy who always did the reading. The guy who knew the difference between metonymy and synecdoche. The guy who was safe. I felt their eyes on me, heavy with shock. This was the moment. The script called for me to look ashamed. It called for me to stammer an apology, to say I was tired, to say I didn't mean it. But I wasn't following her script anymore. I stood up. The sound of my chair legs scraping against the linoleum was a screech of defiance. I didn't rush. I moved with a deliberate slowness, unfolding my frame until I was standing at my full height. I am 6'2", and in that moment, I felt 10 feet tall. I buttoned my suit jacket, a subconscious gesture of armoring up. I looked at Holloway. Her mouth was slightly open. She was waiting for me to disavow the paper, to claim it was a draft submitted by mistake. She couldn't compute that the intelligence she valued and the culture she despised could exist in the same vessel. "Yes, Professor," I said. My voice was steady, deep, projecting to the back of the room without shouting. "That is my submission." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a pendulum swinging. The power in the room was shifting. It was flowing away from the podium and pooling around my desk. She looked at the paper, then at me. "Mr. Thorne," she stammered, This is unlike your usual work. It is barely readable." She was trying to regain her footing, trying to climb back onto her pedestal. "It is a stylistic departure," I acknowledged, keeping my tone polite but icy. "But I assure you it is quite readable, if you understand the language." The challenge was thrown. I wasn't just defending a paper. I was defending a lineage. I saw the students exchanging glances. They sensed the danger. They sensed that the rules of the game were being broken in real time. Holloway flushed. "The language?" she scoffed, trying to find her old rhythm. "It is broken English, Mr. Thorne. It is ungrammatical." I stepped out from behind my desk into the aisle. I wasn't hiding anymore. "It is not broken," I said, taking a step forward. "It is jazz. And just because you cannot tap your foot to the rhythm, Professor, does not mean there is no music." I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I turned the classroom into my own seminar. "You cited the habitual be as an error," I said, my voice filling the room. "But in African-American vernacular English, that construct indicates a continuous state of being, a permanence that standard English lacks the efficiency to convey in 2 words. When I wrote, 'He be steady watching,' I was invoking a surveillance that is eternal, a generational trauma that doesn't blink. You marked it as a fragment. I wrote it as a testament.
I saw a few students nod. They were listening now, really listening. You called the prose pedestrian, I continued, walking slowly down the aisle toward the front. But you teach Zora Neale Hurston, you teach Langston Hughes, you praise them for their authenticity, for capturing the voice of the people. Yet when that same voice appears in your classroom, alive and breathing, you call it illiterate. Why is it art when it's in a library book, but trash when it's on your desk? Holloway opened her mouth to speak, her face patching with red blotches. Mr. Thorne, this is not the time for a lecture on "It is exactly the time," I interrupted, respectfully but firmly. We are studying rhetoric, the art of persuasion, the art of using language to shape reality. My essay argues that the Academy forces black men to amputate parts of their linguistic identity to be taken seriously. And by mocking it before you knew the author, by assuming it came from a place of ignorance rather than intent, you have proved my thesis more effectively than any citation could. The room was electric. I could feel the air vibrating. I pulled my copy of the essay from my notebook. You read my words like a coroner reading an autopsy report, I said. Allow me to read them as they were written. I began to read. I let my voice drop into the register of my grandfather's kitchen. I let the rhythm flow. The words that had sounded clunky and broken in her mouth suddenly snapped into place. They had a beat. They had a melody. The broken grammar revealed itself as a complex, syncopated structure. I saw the realization on the faces of my classmates. They heard the music. I looked at Holloway. She was gripping the podium so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't just losing the argument. She was losing the room. She was losing the illusion of her own infallibility. I finished the paragraph and looked up. Language is a bridge, Professor, I said softly, not a wall. You cannot teach the history of words while refusing to hear the people who speak them.
There is a specific kind of silence that follows the breaking of an idol. It is heavy, awkward, and absolutely necessary. Professor Holloway stood there, stripped of her armor. She looked down at the paper, my paper, as if it were a radioactive object she wished she had never touched. She opened her mouth to retort, to assert her authority, to threaten me with a disciplinary hearing, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the faces of the other students. She saw that she had lost them. If she attacked me now, she would look petty. If she defended her bias, she would look obsolete. So she did the only thing she could do. She retreated. She mumbled something about discussing this further in office hours, and turned her back to the class, picking up an eraser and aggressively wiping away the notes on the chalkboard, creating a cloud of white dust that swirled around her like a fog of confusion. It was a surrender. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, exhausting sadness. It shouldn't have to be this hard. I shouldn't have to turn a classroom into a courtroom just to justify my own voice. I shouldn't have to be exceptional just to be heard. I walked back to my desk. I didn't sit down. The class wasn't over, but my time in this room was. I gathered my notebook, my pen, my laptop. My movements were precise. Click, zip, snap. The sounds were loud in the quiet room. I slung my bag over my shoulder. I looked at Chad. He wasn't smirking anymore. He looked at me with a startled expression, like he was seeing me for the first time. I looked at the rest of them. The future lawyers, the future writers, the future leaders. They had learned more in the last 10 minutes than they had in the entire semester. But it wasn't my job to teach them. I turned toward the door. I didn't ask for permission to leave. I simply walked. The sound of my footsteps was steady, rhythmic, a metronome keeping time for my own life. I passed the podium. I didn't look at Holloway's back. She didn't turn around. She stayed facing the board, hiding in the chalk dust. I walked out the door, the heavy wood closing behind me with a soft final click. I was out of the room, but the weight of it was still on my shoulders. It always is. Walking out into the cool evening air, I felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by the familiar fatigue of the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about. Always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, always measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Today, I had snatched the tape measure from her hands and broken it. But the victory is fleeting. Tomorrow, there will be another Holloway, another essay, another meeting where I have to decide whether to shrink or to stand.
That is the burden of the black man in academia, in corporate America, in the world. We are constantly auditioning for our own humanity. But as I walked across the quad, the setting sun painting the brick buildings in shades of fire and gold, I saw a group of freshmen sitting on a bench. They were black kids, laughing, loud, taking up space, speaking in the very vernacular I had just defended.